Jerusalem, 1170. An archbishop and scholar named William of Tyre takes up a pen to write a history of his kingdom. In it, he records a single quiet memory that will seal the fate of a dynasty. Listen to what he wrote about his 9-year-old pupil, a boy named Baldwin. He was playing one day with his companions, and, as children do, they began to pinch each other's arms and hands with their nails. The others cried out when they were hurt, but Baldwin bore it all with great patience, without even a complaint. William watched the boy. He thought, at first, that his young pupil was simply brave, a stoic prince learning the iron discipline of a future king. But as the game went on, William looked closer. He realized the boy was not ignoring the pain. He simply could not feel it. The skin of his right arm and hand was entirely dead to sensation. And the worst part isn't the numbness, or the quiet realization, or the slow loss of a child's right hand. The worst part is the word William finally had to whisper to the boy's father: leprosy. A word that in the 12th century was not just a medical diagnosis, it was a boundary line. It was the end of your place in the ordinary world of the living. If you were a king, like the boy Baldwin would soon become, it meant a slow public decay under the staggering weight of a crown. But if you were ordinary, a baker, a weaver, a mother, a son, it meant something else entirely. It meant the clapper. Cla, cla, cla. A wooden rattle sounded at intervals on a long, empty road. A sound that told the world you were coming and told the world to turn its face away. You were given a dark, heavy cloak, a pair of thick leather gloves, and a wooden bell. You were told where you could not walk. You were told what you could not touch. You were told who you could not love. You were told, very quietly, by a priest standing over your still-breathing body, you are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. From the moment the wood was placed in your hands, your voice no longer mattered. You belong to the bell now. Welcome to History for Sleepyheads. Tonight, we are stepping on to the quiet, dusty roads of medieval Europe. We are walking away from the warm hearths and the lighted windows of the village, out past the boundary stones to the lazar house at the edge of town. We are not here to look at monsters. We are here to look at people, people who lived and endured and found strange, quiet pockets of grace in the absolute margins of the medieval world. There is no danger here. The road is clear, the night is cool, and the history is safe to step inside. So settle in, pull the blankets up, close your eyes, let the slow knock of the wooden bell fade into the dark, and let's go back. Jerusalem, in the early 1170s. An archbishop and royal tutor named William of Tyre sits in the quiet heat of his study, takes up a pen, and writes down a memory about a boy in a courtyard. He is writing a history of his kingdom, but in this chapter he records a single quiet moment that will outlive the kingdom itself. Listen to what he wrote about his 9-year-old pupil. It chanced that he was playing one day with his companions, and as noble children do, they began to pinch each other's arms and hands with their nails. The others cried out when they were hurt, but Baldwin bore it all with great patience, as if he felt nothing. William watched the boy. He thought, at first, that this was simply the iron discipline of a future monarch. He thought his young pupil was biting his tongue, refusing to show weakness in front of the sons of the nobility, the stoic prince, the brave child. But as the afternoon wore on, William looked closer. He called the boy over to him. He touched the skin of the right arm. He realized the prince was not ignoring the pain. He simply could not feel it. The skin of his right arm, from the elbow down to the fingers, was entirely dead to sensation. And the worst part isn't the numbness or the ruined game or the boy's quiet, blank confusion. The worst part is what the tutor understood in that exact moment. William knew, before the court physicians knew, before the boy's own father, King Amalric, knew, what that unfeeling patch of skin meant. He was looking at the early, unmistakable footprint of leprosy. He was watching the future king of Jerusalem begin to die, one senseless inch of skin at a time. And there was nothing in all the medicine, all the prayers, or all the wealth of the 12th century world that could stop it. In 1174, King Amalric died of dysentery. Baldwin IV was crowned King of Jerusalem. He was 13 years old. The coronation took place on the 15th of July, the anniversary of the First Crusade's capture of the city. The stone floors of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were cool in the high summer heat. The incense, frankincense, and heavy myrrh drifted in thick gray ribbons through the shafts of sunlight falling from the high windows. Bishops in heavy vestments chanted the Latin rites. Lords and barons knelt before a child whose body was already beginning to betray him. The silk of his tunic hid the pale patches of skin. The leather of his boots covered feet that were already losing the ability to feel the cold stone. He was a boy draped in heavy gold, standing in the holiest city in the Christian world, swearing oaths he would not live long enough to fully understand.
And all the while, the disease was moving. Leprosy is not a sudden violence. It is a slow tide. It does not strike you down in a night like the sweating sickness or in a week like the plague. It takes years. It is a quiet, creeping unmaking of the human body. It is a disease of the margins, attacking the cooler extremities of the body first, the lobes of the ears, the tips of the fingers, the toes. It damages the peripheral nerves, quietly severing the communication between the skin and the brain. A person stops feeling the heat of a candle flame. They stop feeling the sharp edge of a knife. They stop feeling the pinch of a playmate's fingernails. Then the muscles begin to waste. The fingers curl inward, pulling into a stiffened claw that cannot be straightened. The voice drops to a hoarse, raspy whisper as the vocal cords thicken. The cartilage in the nose and throat slowly collapses. The sight dims, clouded by damage to the cornea, and finally vanishes into a permanent milky fog. He ruled while his body failed him. The logistics of a dying king are an exercise in both profound dignity and staggering denial. The silk tunics were cut a little looser to avoid chafing the weeping sores. The fine leather gloves were drawn on to hide the curled fingers. When his face began to show the unmistakable thickening of the disease, he appeared before his court heavily veiled. The air in his private chambers was kept thick with burning herbs and sweet rosewater. The disease took his strength, but it did not take his crown. The medieval world had a place even for a dying king, so long as he could still be seen to rule. And rule he did. In the autumn of 1177, when Baldwin was 16 years old, the great Sultan Saladin marched on the kingdom with an army that vastly outnumbered the Christian forces. By any normal measure, a 16-year-old boy in the advanced stages of leprosy should have been in bed, behind thick stone walls, nursed by physicians who read Galen and Hippocrates. Instead, Baldwin rode out to meet them. It was the 25th of November. The dust of the Levant coated the armor of the Frankish knights. The wind was dry. The horses shifted nervously in the scrubland near the hill of Montgisard. Baldwin could barely hold the reins of his horse. His right hand was practically useless. His body was bandaged tightly beneath his armor, the rough wool and heavy chainmail pressing against skin that was both numb and desperately fragile. When the pain of riding became too much, when his weakened limbs could no longer grip the saddle, he was transferred to a litter, a wooden bed, carried between horses, placed right in the center of the vanguard. Against all mathematics, against all military logic, the 16-year-old Leper King broke Saladin's army. He drove them back across the desert. It was a staggering victory, won by a boy who was already slowly dying inside his armor. He returned to Jerusalem a hero. The heavy bells rang out across the city. The choirs sang the Te Deum. The banners snapped in the dry wind. But the disease did not care about Montgisard. It did not retreat. It simply waited for the cheering to stop and continued its quiet, relentless work.
Baldwin's survival as a monarch revealed something vital about the medieval mind. Leprosy was no respecter of rank. It could reach past the palace guards. It could settle into the blood of a dynasty. But rank dictated absolutely everything about how the disease was lived. For the ordinary man or woman, the baker, the weaver, the farmer, the diagnosis meant a complete and permanent severing from human society. A priest would read a liturgy over them. They would be handed a clapper. Cla, cla, cla. They would hear those words, the heaviest words a living person could ever hear. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. They would be pushed to the margins, to the empty roads, to the quiet spaces outside the walls. Once the wood was placed in their hands, they were told, "You belong to the bell now." But Baldwin never belonged to the bell. A crown exempted him from the road. The paradox of the Leper King is that he lived the most private of agonies on the most public of stages. He was not separated from the world. He was bound to it, forced to govern it, forced to hold it together while his own body was unmade piece by piece. By the time he reached his early 20s, the king was entirely blind. He could no longer walk. He could no longer sign his name to the royal charters. He was carried everywhere he went, a phantom monarch wrapped in fine white linen, listening to the voices of his barons, arguing in the dark. The court functioned around him. The clerks still read the decrees aloud. The treasurers still weighed the silver. The guards still snapped to attention when his litter was carried past. It was a kingdom holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable end. He died in the spring of 1185. He was 24 years old. He had ruled for 11 years, and he had been dying for every single one of them. His death left a void that would swallow the kingdom whole. Within 2 years, Jerusalem would fall. But the story of Baldwin IV is not just the story of a lost city. It is the proof of a terrible truth. Leprosy could reach anywhere. It could reach a throne. and if it could reach a throne, it could reach the weaver in his shop, it could reach the baker at her oven, it could reach the farmer in his field. If it could take a king, it could take anyone. And for everyone else, the ones who did not wear a crown, the ones who had no silk to cover their hands, there was no throne waiting. There was only the priest, there was only the road, there was only the bell. From today's view, Baldwin's reign looks like an impossible feat of willpower, a tragic medical anomaly riding at the head of an army. From their view, it was a king enduring the heaviest trial God could lay upon a mortal soul, and bearing it without ever dropping the scepter. And that's what's so chilling.
France, in the middle of the 14th century. A parish priest stands at the altar of a small, quiet stone church. He opens a heavy, leather-bound manual, perhaps a local pontifical or a volume brought down from a cathedral city, and traces his finger down a page of Latin instructions. Listen to the words he is commanded to read aloud. I forbid you ever to enter churches or to go into a market or a mill or a bakehouse. I forbid you ever to wash your hands or even your belongings in the spring or stream of any water. I forbid you to touch anything you wish to buy except with a rod or a stick. I forbid you to answer anyone who questions you on the road unless you have first stepped off the path and are standing downwind of them. He reads these words slowly, carefully, his voice echoing slightly in the cold, empty nave. And the worst part isn't the list of places, or the absolute severing of human contact, or the finality of the banns. The worst part is who he is talking to. He is not reading a sentence of exile to an empty room. He is looking down at a parishioner, a member of his own flock, kneeling on the stone floor beneath a heavy black cloth, a living, breathing human being, listening to the terms of their own erasure. When the diagnosis of leprosy was finally confirmed, the medieval world did not simply banish you. They believed in order. They believed in the profound architectural power of ritual. Before a person could be removed from the world of the living had to formally, spiritually, and publicly let them go. They gave them a funeral. The rite was known as the seclusio leprosorum, the separation of the leper. Its details varied from diocese to diocese across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, but the core of the ceremony was almost always the same. It was the office of the dead performed over a heart that was still beating. The day would begin at the leper's home. The priest would arrive, sometimes accompanied by a small procession carrying a crucifix. The leper would be waiting, wearing their ordinary clothes for the very last time. The priest would sprinkle them with holy water, and together they would walk to the church. It was a procession the entire village would have recognized, the neighbors watching from their doorways, the silence on the street, the slow, measured walk toward the churchyard. Once inside the church, the reality of the rite began. The leper was led to the altar and told to kneel. In many regions, 2 wooden trestles were brought out, and a black pall, the same heavy, dark cloth draped over a coffin during a standard funeral, was draped over the kneeling figure. The cloth was heavy, woven of thick wool. It smelled of the damp chests it was stored in, of old incense, of the countless dead who had slept beneath it before. The point was simple. Whatever life the person kneeling beneath it had lived, as a blacksmith, a daughter, a husband, a farmer, that life was over.
The church was dark. The candles burned down on their iron spikes. The priest began to sing the Requiem Mass, the exact liturgy sung for a corpse. Requiem aeternum dona eis Domine. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord. Beneath the cloth, the leper listened to their own funeral. They heard the chanting of the clerks. They heard the shifting feet of the few family members permitted to stand at the back of the nave. They heard the sound of Latin washing over them, sealing them into a new, liminal state of existence. When the Mass was finished, the black cloth was lifted. The leper was instructed to rise. They were taken to the vestry, or sometimes to the church porch, and stripped of their ordinary clothing. They were handed the garments of their new station, a dark, heavy tunic or cloak, often marked with a specialized cross, thick leather gloves, a pair of sturdy boots. Then came the procession to the churchyard. In some regional manuals, the ritual demanded an even more harrowing piece of theater. The leper would be led to an open grave, dug fresh that morning in the consecrated earth of the cemetery. The leper would be told to stand inside it. The priest would take a spade, dig the iron blade into the loose soil of the graveyard, and cast a shovelful of dirt onto the leper's leather boots. As the earth hit the leather, the priest would speak the words that defined the rest of the leper's natural life. Be dead to the world, reborn to God. It was the ultimate paradox of the medieval mind. The church was not condemning the leper to hell. In many ways, they believed the exact opposite. Leprosy was viewed as an earthly purgatory, a terrifying but sacred trial. By suffering the pains of purgatory here on earth, the leper was believed to be fast-tracked to heaven upon their actual physical death. They were considered closer to the divine than the healthy people watching from the churchyard wall. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. Standing there by the cemetery, the priest would read the prohibitions, the strict, unbending rules of a separated life: not to enter a church, not to draw from a well, not to answer a stranger who speaks to you. They were told they could no longer eat with healthy people, not even their own children. They could no longer walk down a narrow lane if the wind was blowing toward an approaching traveler. And then the final, most crucial part of the rite. The priest reached out and handed the leper an object. It was a clapper. Sometimes a small brass handbell, but more often a wooden rattle, known in some regions as a clacla. 2 boards of oak or ash hinged together with a leather strap or a wooden dowel. If you walk into certain museum archives in Europe today, you can still see them. They are quiet things, sitting under climate-controlled glass. The wood is dark with age. The handles are worn incredibly smooth, polished by the friction of a human thumb, gripping it year after year. They look innocuous, like crude musical instruments or rhythm blocks. But 700 years ago, they were the heaviest objects in the world. When the priest placed the wood into the leper's gloved hands, he was taking away their voice. A leper was forbidden to shout, forbidden to call out a warning using their own throat. The wood would do the speaking for them. The sharp, clattering knock of the boards was the only sound they were permitted to make to announce their presence on the road. Once the clapper was placed in your hand, you were told, you belong to the bell now. Cla, cla, cla. There is a modern instinct to look at this ritual, the black cloth, the open grave, the Latin dirge, and assume it meant total erasure. It is often repeated in modern retellings that the Mass of separation made the leper legally a corpse. that they were entirely stripped of all their property, their inheritances dissolved, their marriages instantly annulled, leaving them as penniless ghosts entirely devoid of civil rights. But the reality of medieval law was infinitely more complex and in some ways infinitely sadder. The idea that a leper was civilitur mortuus, dead in the eyes of the law, is largely a later legal exaggeration, popularized centuries after the height of the disease. In truth, practice varied wildly from town to town. If we look at the surviving court rolls and municipal records of the 13th and 14th centuries, we see something startling. We see lepers keeping their land. We see them quietly managing estates through appointed proxies. We see them fiercely defending their property rights in court, suing their neighbors and being sued in return. We see them carefully dictating complex wills, leaving silver and linens to their grandchildren. The massive separation was a spiritual death and a profound social death. It severed you from the daily engine of the village, from the warmth of the tavern, the shared water of the well, the communion of the parish mass, but it did not erase you from the parchment of the king's courts, and that makes the funeral so much heavier. The leper was not a ghost who had forgotten the world. They were still a citizen, still a property owner, still a person with legal standing and a sharp memory of the life they had just been forced to leave. They knew exactly what they were losing. They retained all their human attachments, all their legal intelligence, all their longing, while trapped inside a body that society required to be a walking tomb. When the rite was finally over, the priest would offer a final blessing. A bowl of alms might be collected from the attending villagers and poured into the leper's gloved hands, and then the crowd would part. The priest would turn and walk back into the cool stone of the church. The villagers would turn and walk back to the bakehouse, the mill, and the market. And the leper would turn the other way, out past the churchyard gate, out past the boundary stones of the village, out onto the dirt road that led away from everything they had ever known, walking under the open sky, feeling the warmth of the midday sun on a face that was, according to the liturgy, no longer there. From today's view, this rite looks like a piece of Gothic theater, an act of psychological cruelty dressed up as a sacrament. From their view, it was the only orderly way to manage an agonizing boundary between the living and the dead. And that's what's so chilling. Lincoln, England, in the final years of the 12th century. A monk named Adam of Aynsham, serving as chancellor to the bishop, takes up a pen to write a biography of his master. In it, he records a single astonishing scene inside a leper hospital. Listen to what he wrote. When he entered the houses of the lepers, he would wash their hands and their feet. And he would not only wash them, but he would kiss the sores of the afflicted with his own lips. Adam watched him do it. The chancellor was a learned man, but he was terrified of the disease. He shrank back. He covered his face. He watched his bishop, a man named Hugh, who would one day be canonized as a saint, willingly embrace bodies that were actively unmaking themselves. And the worst part isn't the physical risk, or the smell of the lazar house, or the chancellor's quiet, lingering horror. The worst part is the theological reality the bishop explained to him next. When Adam of Aynsham asked how the bishop could touch such corrupted flesh, Hugh of Lincoln turned to his chancellor and told him they were looking at it entirely backwards. These people were not cursed. They were not outcasts. These afflicted ones, the bishop told him, are the flowers of paradise. They are the jewels in the crown of the eternal King. There is a question that naturally rises from the open grave of the mass of separation. Why? Why go to the trouble of reading a funeral over a living person? Why the heavy black cloth, the cast earth, the wooden clapper, the absolute exile? It is easy to look back at the medieval world and see only a mindless, panicking cruelty. A society frightened of a disease it did not understand, lashing out at the victims. But the medieval world was not mindless. It was highly structured, highly analytical, and profoundly sincere. The way they treated the leper was not the result of panic. It was the logical, necessary product of a coherent worldview. To understand the leper, you must first stand inside the medieval mind and see the disease the way they saw it. And the most surprising thing you find there is not only horror, it is the paradox that Bishop Hugh was describing. To many in the Middle Ages, leprosy was the holy disease. We have to remember what the afterlife meant to a medieval Christian. It was not an abstract concept, it was a physical, terrifying geography. Almost everyone, no matter how good they were, expected to go to purgatory after death. Purgatory was a place of literal fire, a temporary hell where the soul was burned clean of its everyday sins before it could enter heaven. It could take thousands of years. It was a prospect that haunted the waking hours of kings and peasants alike. But the leper was different. Theologians argued that if God struck a person with leprosy, he was not destroying them, he was electing them. The disease was seen as an earthly purgatory. The leper was being scoured clean while they still breathed. They were doing their suffering now in the physical body, so that the moment they died, their soul would bypass the fires entirely and fly straight to the throne of God. They were the ultimate earthly mirror of the biblical figure of Job, stripped of everything, covered in sores, tested by the divine to prove their enduring faith.
Because they were suffering their purgatory in the mud and the cold of the temporal world, they were believed to be closer to heaven than the healthy people who pitied them, closer to God than the merchants who dropped coins in their bowls, closer to God even than the priest who read their funeral. This was not just poetry, it was established doctrine. It is the exact reason the priest spoke those words at the edge of the churchyard. It is the reason the liturgy was written the way it was. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. But medieval theology was a pendulum, and it swung both ways. If the disease was a mark of divine election, it was also, undeniably, a punishment. And this is the darker side of the belief system. The medieval mind believed that the physical body was a direct reflection of the spiritual soul. If the body was rotting, it was because the soul had rotted first. Leprosy was widely viewed as the physical manifestation of hidden sin. And not just any sin. In the popular imagination, the disease was inextricably linked to the sins of the flesh, to lust, to venereal excess. Because leprosy often altered the voice, making it hoarse and rasping, and because it sometimes caused the loss of facial hair, medieval observers drew a straight line between the disease and a corruption of the blood caused by unholy passions. They believed that a soul burning with illicit desire would literally heat the blood, cooking it from the inside until the corruption pushed its way out through the skin. The leper was a walking, breathing confession, a secret sin made public by the hand of God. This theological paradox, the leper as the holiest of sufferers and the most corrupt of sinners, was matched perfectly by the medical science of the age. When a medieval physician was called to examine a suspected leper, he did not look for a microbe, he looked for an imbalance. This was the era of humoral theory, based on the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates. The body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a perfect balance. Disease was a catastrophic shift. Leprosy was diagnosed as the ultimate humoral collapse. The heavy, learned medical texts of the 13th century, like the encyclopedia written by Bartholomeus Anglicus, explained it clearly. Leprosy was an overwhelming excess of black bile, melancholy, that had corrupted the blood. The physician would bring the patient into a room. He would look at the color of their face. He would listen to the tenor of their breathing. He would draw blood into a shallow brass bowl, waiting to see how it cooled in the drafty air, looking for a gritty, corrupted texture. He would examine the urine, holding a glass vial up to the candlelight, searching for a cloudy, ashen sediment that indicated the internal organs were breaking down. The theory was that the excess black bile was literally rotting the body from the inside out. The numbness in the fingers, the thickening of the brow, the weeping sores, these were not the disease itself. They were the body's desperate, failing attempt to push the internal poison out to the surface. And where did this corruption come from? The physicians had answers for that, too. It could come from a bad diet. Eating rotten meat or drinking stagnant water could introduce corrupt matter into the stomach, which would then taint the blood.
It could come from miasma, corrupt, heavy air blowing off a swamp or a battlefield, breathed into the lungs and settling in the heart. Medieval medicine believed fiercely that bad air carried disease and that a healthy person could catch leprosy simply by standing downwind of a leper's corrupted breath. And, in perhaps the most highly documented and tragic medical belief of the age, it could come from a sinful conception. The medical texts explicitly taught that if a child was conceived during a woman's menstrual period, a time of ritual and physical impurity in the medieval mind, the corrupted blood in the womb would taint the child. The infant might be born looking perfectly healthy, but the dark seed was planted. 10, 20, or 30 years later, the black bile would rise, and the disease would finally show its face. The child was doomed to the clapper because of a sin committed by the parents in the dark of a bedroom 3 decades earlier. When you combine these massive frameworks, the theological and the medical, the treatment of the leper suddenly makes perfect, devastating sense. If the disease is a physical corruption that can spread through foul breath and tainted air, the community must be protected. The leper must be removed. They must wear a heavy cloak to contain the miasma. They must stand downwind. They must never touch the common well, lest their corrupted humors poison the drinking water. And if the disease is also a holy trial, a sacred purgatory ordained by God, then sending them away is not an act of murder. It is an act of religious destiny. The village is safe, and the leper is set on the hard, lonely path to heaven. Belief and action perfectly joined. This is why they were sent to the edge of town. This is why the clapper was placed in their hands. The wood was not just to warn people away, it was to prevent the leper from having to shout, which would expel more corrupted air from their lungs. Once the medical diagnosis was confirmed and the theological reality was accepted, there was no other way. The healthy retreated to the warmth of the hearth, the afflicted turned toward the road, and they were told, under the vast, quiet sky, "You belong to the bell now." Cla, cla, cla. The sound of a shattered humoral balance, the sound of an earthly purgatory, of a person who was no longer allowed to be simply human, but had been turned into a walking symbol of God's terrible grace. It would take 700 years for the symbol to be dismantled. It was not until 1873, in a quiet laboratory in Norway, that a physician named Gerhard Armauer Hansen looked through the lens of a microscope and finally saw the truth. He did not see black bile. He did not see the physical manifestation of lust. He saw a rod-shaped bacterium. Today, we know it as Mycobacterium leprae. We know that it is a slow-growing microbe that attacks the peripheral nerves. We know that it has nothing to do with conception or diet or the wrath of God. And we know, perhaps most tragically of all, that it is only weakly contagious. In fact, modern science tells us that roughly 95% of the human population is naturally immune to it. You could sit in the same room as a leper, you could breathe the same air, you could drink from the same well, and the vast, overwhelming majority of humanity would never catch it. The absolute lifelong exile was largely unnecessary. From today's view, the medieval belief system looks like a tragic architecture of superstition, a net of bad theology and flawed medicine that caught innocent people and buried them alive. From their view, it was the highest science and the deepest faith they possessed, working together to make sense of the incomprehensible. And that's what's so chilling.
Winchester, England, on a high chalk ridge just east of the city walls. In the late 2000s, a team of archaeologists working at the medieval site of the Hospital of St. Mary Magdalene began to brush the soil away from a burial they designated simply as Skeleton 8. We do not have his real name. The parish registers and hospital rolls from the 12th century have largely burned to ash or rotted to dust, or simply been lost to the vast indifference of time. But we have his bones, and listen to what his bones tell us. The young man, who was probably in his late 20s, had suffered from profound advanced leprosy. The bones of his face had undergone severe structural collapse. The bones of his hands and his feet had almost entirely dissolved away. And the worst part isn't the missing fingers, or the collapsed facial structure, or the tragically young age at which he was laid in the ground. The worst part is what the extreme state of his body actually proves. He did not die alone in a ditch. He did not freeze to death in a forest. A person with no hands and no feet cannot feed themselves. They cannot draw water from a well. They cannot pull a heavy wool blanket up against the damp English cold. The bones of Skeleton 8 prove an absolute, undeniable reality. For years, as his body was unmade by the disease, someone washed him. Someone fed him warm broth. Someone kept him alive. For 3 chapters, we have looked at leprosy from a high altitude. We have watched a king. We have listened to a priest. We have unspooled the heavy theology of the humoral mind. But the disease did not happen to theories. It happened to people. It happened to boys who worked in bakeries. It happened to weavers and blacksmiths and daughters and fathers. Let us step down from the throne and stand in the chalky dirt of Winchester. Let us look at what the mass of separation meant when the person kneeling beneath the black cloth was not an abstract symbol, but a young man who had a home, a trade, and a family. Before the diagnosis, he lived in the sensory rush of the medieval town. Let us imagine he was a baker's apprentice. He knew the smell of the yeast in the early hours before dawn. He knew the intense, radiating heat of the stone oven. He knew the friction of the wooden peel, sliding the heavy loaves into the dark heat. His hands were his livelihood. They were dusted with flour, strong from kneading the heavy dough, calloused from the rough ash wood of the tools. He belonged to the village. He belonged to the fire and the bread. And then, the quiet shift, a dropped knife, a patch of skin on his right forearm that looked a little too pale, a little too smooth. A day when he reached into the oven to pull a loaf free, brushed his knuckles against the searing hot stone, and realized, with a sudden dropping cold in his stomach, that he felt absolutely nothing.
The physician was called. The urine was checked. The humoral balance was declared broken. The verdict was handed down. We have heard the liturgy of the Mass of Separation. We know the Latin. But think of it now from the inside of the church, from the perspective of the boy on his knees. He walked into his own parish church. The stone floor was cold. The air smelled of old wax and damp wool. He looked back toward the nave and saw the people he had grown up with. He saw his master, the baker, standing quietly near a pillar. He saw his mother, her face completely still, holding her breath in the terrible quiet of the nave. When the heavy black cloth was draped over him, he was not thinking about purgatory. He was in the dark, smelling the dust in the weave of the wool, listening to the priest sing the Requiem Mass. He was listening to his own funeral, knowing that when the cloth was lifted, he would never be allowed to touch his mother again. The priest led him to the church door. The heavy boots were put on his feet. The dark cloak was fastened at his neck. The wooden clapper was placed into his hands, hands that were already beginning to stiffen, the fingers already beginning to pull inward. The wood was smooth. It was heavy. Cla, cla, cla. The priest looked at the young man, spoke the final blessing, and handed him over to the dark. He was told with absolute finality, "You belong to the bell now." He walked out of the churchyard, and the iron gate was closed behind him. He took his first steps on the dirt road. Every time he moved his hand, the wood struck itself. He saw his neighbors turn their backs. He saw the children run into the alleyways. The sound was a wedge, driving the world apart, creating a bubble of empty space wherever he walked. He was walking out of his own life. He walked away from the bakery and the oven and the flour. He climbed the steep, chalky path up Magdalen Hill, the wind blowing hard off the downs. He was walking toward the hospital of St. Mary Magdalene. He was walking toward a place that the modern imagination pictures as a hellhole, a prison of misery and rotting flesh, where the outcasts were dumped to die out of sight. But when he reached the top of the hill, he did not find a prison. He found a community. The hospital of St. Mary Magdalene was an ordered, quiet, monastic space. It had a master. It had a chapel with a bell that rang the canonical hours. It had dormitories built of stone and stout timber. The beds were lined with clean straw, changed regularly to keep the damp out of the bones. When the young man arrived, he was not thrown into a pit. He was received by the brothers and sisters of the hospital. He was given a bed. He was given a wooden bowl. This is the first of the 3 small mercies we find in the record of the separated life. The hospital was endowed by the wealthy, bishops, lords, sometimes kings, which meant the young man did not have to beg in the mud. He was guaranteed a daily allowance of food, pottage, bread, weak ale, and on feast days a portion of meat.
And he needed that food because the disease was not finished with him. Over the next 5, 10, perhaps 15 years, the bacteria slowly did its work. His voice thickened to a raspy whisper. His sight failed, and his hands, the strong, calloused hands that had kneaded the dough, slowly collapsed. The bones resorbed into the body. The fingers disappeared. The feet withered, leaving him entirely unable to walk. He became a prisoner of his own failing anatomy. But he was not abandoned. The archaeology of Skeleton 8 proves a staggering level of daily physical devotion. Imagine the patience required. The medieval winter was bitter. The wind came through the wooden shutters. Someone had to keep the fire stoked. Someone had to boil the water. Someone in that hospital, perhaps a nursing brother, perhaps a fellow leper whose hands were still whole, sat beside his bed every single day. When the young man could no longer hold his wooden bowl, someone lifted it to his lips. When he could no longer chew hard bread, someone softened it in warm broth. When he soiled his linens because he could not move to the latrine, someone brought warm water, washed his body, and gave him clean sheets. They did this not for a week or a month, but for years. They did it because they believed the theology. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. The young man lying in that bed with no hands and no face was not a monster to them. He was a holy sufferer. He was doing his purgatory on the chalky hill of Winchester. Nursing him was an act of profound spiritual gravity. Every cup of water lifted to his lips was a coin dropped into the treasury of heaven. Eventually, the young man died. The chapel bell, a real bell, heavy and made of bronze, not the wooden clapper of the road, tolled across the downs. His death was not treated like the disposal of infected waste. His body was washed. He was wrapped in a clean linen shroud, pinned carefully with brass shrouding pins. A grave was dug in the chalky earth of the hospital cemetery. The grave was cut neatly. It was not a mass pit. The young man was laid in the earth with profound care. He was placed on his back, his arms crossed over his chest, his feet pointing toward the east. He was laid facing the rising sun, in the traditional Christian posture, waiting for the day of resurrection, the day when the medieval mind believed his body would rise from the dirt, entirely whole, entirely healed, and perfectly restored.
We spend so much time looking at the horror of the medieval world. We look at the decrees, the exiles, the black cloth, the cast earth. We read the harsh Latin of the councils. We assume it was a time of unbroken cruelty. But the bones of the young man from Winchester tell a quieter, harder story. They tell us that behind every decree there was a person. They tell us that most lepers were poor, ordinary people who lost everything in a single afternoon. And they tell us that the record, if we read it closely, preserves love just as often as it preserves fear. The young man was exiled, yes, but he was also nursed through years of unimaginable physical collapse by hands that did not flinch from his own missing ones. From today's view, the lazar house looks like a terminal ward, a dark place where the incurable were hidden away from the healthy world. From their view, it was a sanctuary of the living saints, a place where the broken were tended with the deepest reverence the age could muster. And that's what's so chilling. London, in the climate-controlled quiet of a medical history archive, a wooden object sits on a piece of archival foam, resting under a pane of museum glass. It is incredibly simple. 2 flat boards of ash wood bound together at the base by a thick leather hinge with a smoothed handle at the bottom. It is called a clacklaw, or a leper's clapper. Listen to how it was used. The leper shall carry a clapper of wood. He shall sound it continuously when passing through any place where people might be gathered, that they may be warned of his coming and keep their distance. Look closely at the handle under the glass. It is dark with age, but the wood is polished almost entirely smooth. It was polished by the friction of a human thumb, gripping it tightly, day after day, year after year. And the worst part isn't the crude construction or the flat, dry noise it made, or the wear on the handle. The worst part is the strange, terrible courtesy it represented. The clapper was not an instrument of punishment. It was a practical compromise. It was a way to say, without words, I am coming. You have time to step back. A human voice, a whole life reduced to the dry knock of wood. If we want to understand what the mass of separation actually meant, we have to look past the dramatic theater of the open grave. We have to look at the Tuesday mornings. We have to look at the rainy afternoons. We have to look at the slow, quiet, profoundly regulated daily reality of a life lived entirely on the margins. The medieval world was a world of laws. It abhorred a vacuum, and it abhorred chaos. When it separated the leper from the village, it did not simply banish them into the wilderness to starve. It built an architecture of rules for them to live inside. It was a deeply bureaucratic, oddly practical system designed to manage a paradox. The leper was spiritually dead, but physically alive. And since they might go on living for decades, society had to figure out exactly how the living and the dead were going to share the same roads. Let us walk through the inventory of a separated life. It began with the dress. The habit was made of heavy russet, or thick undyed wool, or sometimes coarse felt, woven tightly and left unbleached, so that it looked from a distance the color of dry earth. The point was simple. Whatever the leper was touching, and nobody in the 13th century wanted to share a surface with the corrupted humors of a leper, they should be insulated from the healthy world. The tunic sealed the body. It went down past the ankles. It fastened securely at the neck. The hood sat over the top to cover the hair and obscure the face. The gloves were heavy leather. The boots were thick hide. The cane was a smooth rod of white ash, or sometimes hazel. The leper was required to wear this habit every time they stepped out of their dwelling. To be caught without it was to invite severe fines or the loss of their alms. It was a uniform of exile, visible from a quarter mile. Then came the sound. Before they took a step onto a public path, they had to raise their hand. Cla, cla, cla. They were forbidden to shout. Shouting expelled the corrupted air from their lungs, casting miasma into the breeze. The wood did the speaking for them. In some regions, it was a small brass handbell. In others, the wooden rattle. The sound was flat, unmusical, and deeply lonely. It echoed against the stone walls of the alleyways. It carried across the flat, frozen fields of the winter farms. It became the only voice they had left. The day the priest handed them the wood, the transaction was absolute. You belong to the bell now. With the habit on and the clapper sounding, the leper moved into a world governed by a rigid spatial geography. The prohibitions read over them at their funeral dictated exactly where they could and could not place their physical body. They were forbidden to enter a mill. The mill was a warm, dusty place, thick with the smell of ground grain, where the village gathered to wait for their flour. They were forbidden to enter a bakehouse. The heat of the ovens was thought to agitate the corrupt humors, and the shared space was too dangerous for the healthy bread. They were forbidden to touch the rope or the bucket of the common well. Water was the lifeblood of the medieval town. The well was the center of the square. To a humoral physician, a leper touching the wet rope with their leather gloves was equivalent to pouring black bile directly into the drinking water. If a leper was thirsty, they had to find a running stream, and even then they were legally required to draw their water downstream from the village, never above it. But lepers still had to eat. They still had to buy provisions with the alms they collected or the stipends they received from their properties. And so the rules made a strange practical allowance for the marketplace. A leper could enter a market, but they could not touch the goods. Imagine the discipline this required. The leper stood before the baker's stall. The smell of the warm loaves filled the air. The leper kept their thick leather gloves pulled tight. They raised their white ash stick, the virga, and pointed the wooden tip at the loaf they wanted to buy. "I will have that one." The merchant would slide the loaf into the leper's open sack, being careful not to let their hands brush. The coins would be dropped into a wooden bowl or left on a stone. The transaction was completed without a single millimeter of physical contact. The most intimate and heartbreaking rules, however, governed the simple act of walking and talking. Medieval roads were often little more than dirt tracks, rutted by cartwheels and hemmed in by high hedgerows. If a leper was walking down a narrow lane and heard a healthy person approaching, the jingle of a horse's harness, the footsteps of a merchant, they were forbidden to pass them on the path. The leper had to stop. They had to ring the bell. They had to step completely off the road, pushing into the briars or the ditch, and wait until the healthy person had passed by. And if the traveler stopped to ask a question, if a stranger, not realizing who they were talking to in the dim evening light, asked the distance to the next town,
the leper could not simply answer. They had to stop. They had to feel the air on their face. They had to determine the direction of the wind. They had to position themselves entirely downwind of the traveler before they opened their mouth to speak, ensuring that the breeze carried their breath away into the empty fields rather than into the lungs of the stranger. Look at the extraordinary meteorological and spatial awareness this required. A leper had to know exactly where the wind was blowing every minute of the day. They had to know exactly how wide a lane was. They had to know exactly where the well water flowed. They became ghosts who were hyper-aware of the physical world they were no longer allowed to touch. This is what makes the separated life so fascinating and so deeply sad. It was not a chaotic frenzy of violence. It was a meticulously maintained system of distance. The rules were absolute, but they were designed to allow the leper to exist, to breathe, to buy bread, to walk in the sun. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. The mass of separation handled the theology. The clapper, the cloak, the stick, and the wind handled the daily reality. If you walk through a museum at night, after the crowds have gone, and you look at the heavy wool of a surviving habit or the polished ashwood of a pointing stick, you do not see the tools of a murder. You see the tools of a terrible, enduring patience. You see objects built for a life that was expected to go on for a very, very long time. The medieval world did not know how to cure the disease, but they knew exactly how to live next to it. From today's view, this looks like an architecture of crushing paranoid segregation, a life reduced to a pointing stick and a warning rattle. From their view, it was a practical, necessary courtesy to let the living and the dead share the exact same roads. And that's what's so chilling.
London, 1101. A queen of England named Matilda, the wife of King Henry I, stands in the dim light of her private chambers. According to the chronicles recorded by the abbot Aelred of Rievaulx, her brother, David, the Prince of Scotland, comes to visit her. He opens the door to the royal apartments, expecting to find the queen surrounded by her ladies in waiting. Instead, he finds the room filled with lepers. Listen to what the chronicler wrote about what the queen was doing. She was washing the feet of the lepers and drying them with a towel and kissing their sores with her own lips. Her brother, the prince, was utterly horrified. He shrank back into the doorway. He told her that if the king knew what she was doing, he would never kiss her on the mouth again. Matilda simply looked up from the basin of water, smiled, and told her brother that she was washing the feet of the eternal king. And the worst part isn't the shock of the young prince, or the physical risk the queen was taking, or the smell of the room. The worst part is what this single, documented act of royal charity does to our modern assumptions. We assume that once the Mass of separation was read and the clapper was placed in the leper's hand, the story ended in a ditch. We assume the Middle Ages did nothing but cast the afflicted out into the dark to starve, treating them like infected animals to be hunted or ignored. But the medieval world was infinitely more complex and in its own strange way infinitely kinder than we remember. The same society that read a funeral over a living person also built that person a home. When the leper walked out of the churchyard, their wooden clapper echoing in the quiet air, they were not always walking into a trackless wasteland. Very often they were walking toward a specific built environment at the edge of the town. They were walking to the leprosarium, the lazar house. The name itself was a small mercy. It came from the biblical figure of Lazarus, the beggar covered in sores, who was carried by angels to the side of Abraham. If we want to understand the lazar house, we have to strip away the modern image of a dungeon or a prison ward. The classic medieval leper hospital was a religious foundation. It was an ordered, quiet, architectural space. It usually consisted of a central hall, a row of small wooden beds lined with clean straw, a kitchen, a brewhouse, and, most importantly, a chapel. There was almost always a garden planted with medicinal herbs, comfrey, lungwort, and sage, tended by the residents whose hands were still able to work the soil. The geography of the lazar house was a perfect physical reflection of the medieval paradox. It was always situated at a very specific distance. It was built outside the city walls to honor the medical and theological requirement of separation, but it was built close to the main roads, right on the arterial highways leading into the city. It was near enough for the lepers to collect alms from passing merchants, near enough for the townspeople to hear the chapel bell, but far enough to maintain the boundary.
These houses were not rare anomalies. They were an industry of charity. Queen Matilda herself founded the Hospital of St. Giles in the Fields, just outside the walls of London, the very same year her brother caught her washing the leper's feet. Decades earlier, the great Archbishop Lanfranc founded the Hospital of St. Nicholas at Harbledown near Canterbury, a house composed of timber-framed buildings and a stone church on a quiet, sloping hill. At Burton Lazars in Leicestershire, an enormous complex was built that would become the headquarters of the English branch of the Order of St. Lazarus. By the time the disease reached its peak in the 13th century, historians estimate there were over 300 leper hospitals scattered across England alone, and thousands more across France and the Holy Roman Empire. But what actually happened inside them? When a leper was admitted to a foundation like St. Giles or Harbledown, they did not just lie in a bed and wait for the end. They entered a rule of life. Many of these houses were run on quasi-monastic lines. The lepers were required to wear a specific uniform. They took vows of obedience to the master or prior of the house. They were forbidden from wandering the countryside, forbidden from frequenting taverns, forbidden from bringing scandal to the community. And, above all, they were required to pray. This is the engine that built the lazar houses. This is why queens, bishops, and wealthy wool merchants poured staggering sums of silver into endowing them. It was a transaction of spiritual economics. Remember the theological foundation. The leper is suffering their purgatory on earth. Because they are being scoured clean by the disease, their soul is uniquely close to God. Therefore, the prayers of a leper were considered incredibly potent. They were a direct, unhindered line to heaven. When a wealthy lord endowed a hospital, paying for the stone of the chapel and the daily bread of the inmates, he was not just being kind, he was purchasing the daily prayers of the most spiritually powerful people in the kingdom. The lepers were required to attend the chapel every day, to hear the Mass, and to pray explicitly for the soul of their founder, for the king, and for the healthy townspeople who dropped coins in their wooden bowls. They were not useless outcasts, they were spiritual laborers. The disease had taken their trades. They could no longer be blacksmiths or weavers, but the hospital gave them a new profession. They were the intercessors for a sinful world. Quote, "You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once." Unquote. In the Lazar house, the second half of that sentence became a literal daily occupation. We can see the deepest manifestation of this in the military orders of the Crusades. The Order of St. Lazarus began as a nursing brotherhood in Jerusalem, specifically dedicated to caring for lepers. But it evolved into something entirely unique in human history. When a knight of the Templars or the Hospitallers contracted leprosy, he was not cast out in disgrace. He was transferred to the Order of St. Lazarus. He put on a mantle with a green cross, and if he was still able to sit a horse and hold a sword, he rode into battle alongside his fellow lepers, fighting for the Holy Land under the banner of the afflicted. A brotherhood of the dying, caring for their own and defending their own.
It is easy to romanticize this. We must be careful not to paint the Lazar house as a medieval paradise. They were still hospitals for an incurable, devastating disease. The smell of the wards, despite the burning of herbs and incense, was heavy with the reality of decaying flesh. The resources often ran thin. When a famine struck the countryside, the hospitals were the first to go hungry. And admission was not guaranteed. Many houses had strict limits on how many inmates they could support, 30, perhaps 40 at a time. The lepers who could not secure a bed in a foundation were forced to live in rudimentary huts in the forests or beg on the frozen roads. The separation was still absolute. Even inside the hospital, the healthy brethren who nursed the sick were required to maintain careful boundaries. In many hospital chapels, a small architectural feature called a leper squint, a narrow slit cut through the thick stone wall, allowed the afflicted to watch the priest elevate the host at the altar from a safe, separated distance. They were still exiled, but they were exiled together. Think of the psychological shift. You are a young woman who has just endured the mass of separation. You have walked out of the churchyard to the sound of your own wooden clapper. Clah, clah, clah. You think you're entirely alone. But you walk down the highway and you see the stone walls of the hospital. You pass through the gate. You enter the hall, and you see 30 other people wearing the same heavy cloak. You see 30 other people whose hands are wrapped in linen. You sit by the hearth fire, and you are no longer the terrifying monster of the village. You are simply a sister of the house. When the chapel bell rings the canonical hours, calling the community to vespers, it replaces the sound of the clapper. For the first time since the priest handed you the wood, you are not ringing a bell to warn people away. A bell is ringing to call you in. You belong to the bell now, but in the house at the edge of town, the bell means community. This is the profound, counterintuitive truth of the medieval response to leprosy. The society was terrified of the disease, yes. They enforced strict, brutal rules of quarantine, yes. But at their very best, they did not lose their humanity. They built institutions that fed, clothed, and dignified the afflicted. They recognized that the leper was still a child of God, capable of offering a spiritual service to the world that had cast them out. From today's view, the lazar house looks like a quarantine camp dressed up as a monastery, a way to hide the incurable from the sight of the healthy. From their view, it was a sanctuary of grace, a place where the living saints could do their holy work while the world watched in awe. And that's what's so chilling.
Rouen, France, in the early years of the 14th century, a room inside the complex of the bishop's palace, its thick stone walls keeping out the heat of the midday sun. A man who has been accused by his neighbors of carrying the disease is brought into the quiet, cool chamber to face a panel of examiners. A clerk sits at a heavy oak table, smoothing a piece of sheepskin parchment, ready to record the official verdict of the Judicium Leprosorum, the judgment of the lepers. Listen to the criteria they were looking for, as laid out in the medical and legal manuals of the age. The hoarseness of the voice, the thinning and falling of the hair, the corruption of the skin, the thickening of the lips, and the absolute loss of feeling in the extremities. The man is told to strip. The examiners step forward in the dim light. They look at the color of his face. They test the sensitivity of his hands and his feet. And the worst part isn't the cold of the room, or the indignity of the examination, or the scratch of the clerk's quill on the parchment. The worst part is the identity of the people doing the looking. The panel did not just consist of a priest or a university-trained physician. In many regions, the authorities recognized a simple, practical truth. The people best at recognizing leprosy were the lepers. And so the examining jury often included residents of the local lazar house. More than once, the absolute last judgment a person faced from the healthy world was delivered in part by those who were already on the other side of it. They were asked to look at a frightened stranger shivering in the cold of an examination room and say whether this person now belonged with them. This is the hidden machinery of the medieval response. We have walked through the theology and the funeral and the house at the edge of town. But beneath the profound spiritual drama of the disease, there was an incredibly ordinary, bureaucratic foundation. It is the quietest, least dramatic part of the history, and in its own way, the most revealing. Before a life could be separated, two deeply mundane questions had to be answered. Who decided you were a leper, and who paid for the life you lived afterward? The examination process was careful, deliberate, and entirely procedural. The medieval world knew that the mass of separation was a devastating sentence, and they did not hand it down lightly. It was not a matter of a panicked mob chasing a person out of a village with pitchforks. It was a matter of law. When a person was suspected, they were summoned. The panel convened. If a physician or surgeon was available, they would lead the physical inspection. They would draw a small amount of blood, watching how it clotted in a brass basin. They would examine the urine for the cloudy sediment that humoral theory demanded. They would take a small iron needle and press it firmly into the skin of the suspect's heel or the flesh of their forearm, watching closely to see if the person flinched.
The inclusion of experienced lepers on these panels is one of the most remarkable administrative details of the age. It was an acknowledgement of lived expertise. The lepers knew the subtle, early signs better than any theoretical medical text. They knew the specific sheen of the skin, the exact quality of the hoarse breath, the way the fingers first began to curl. But the system was profoundly fallible. The medieval medical label for the disease was lepra, and it was a massive, imperfect umbrella. Without a microscope, without the ability to identify a specific bacterium, the examining juries swept many different conditions into the same terrifying category: severe psoriasis, advanced eczema, vitiligo, fungal infections of the skin. These could all produce the weeping sores, the pale patches, and the corrupted skin that the manuals described. Countless people who did not have Hansen's disease, who possessed no corrupted humors and posed no theoretical danger, were caught in the net of the judicium. Yet the bureaucracy also allowed for escape. The panels did not always condemn. If the signs were inconclusive, or if the jury decided the skin condition was a temporary affliction of the blood rather than true lepra, the person was cleared. The clerk would draft a formal certificate of health. Warm wax would be dripped onto the parchment. The bishop's heavy lead seal would be pressed into the wax. The person would be handed the document and allowed to walk back into the warm, lighted spaces of the village, legally protected from the accusations of their neighbors. But if the needle drew no flinch, if the blood was thick and gritty, if the leper on the panel nodded their head, then the verdict was recorded. The diagnosis was the exact moment the belonging was decided. The paperwork was signed. The clerk sanded the ink. The mechanism of separation engaged. The suspect was sent to the church for their funeral, and from that moment on, they were told, "You belong to the bell now." Once the clapper was in their hand and the heavy habit was on their shoulders, the second question immediately arose: how did this person survive? We have seen the lazar houses, the hospitals like St. Giles and Harbledown and Burton Lazars, but stones require masons, bread require flour, small wooden beds require fresh straw. The houses at the edge of town did not run on prayer alone. They ran on a massive, complex, and highly structured economy of endowments, rents, and alms. This is the business book of mercy. The economics of the lazar house were deeply embedded in the financial life of the medieval town. When a hospital was founded, the king or the local bishop did not simply build it and walk away. They endowed it with a permanent stream of revenue. They granted the hospital the deed to a tract of fertile farmland so the lepers could collect the rent from the tenant farmers. They granted the hospital the right to collect a specific toll, perhaps a silver penny from every cart of firewood that entered the city gates, or a fraction of the tax on the annual wool fair. This was institutionalized grace. The hospital became a landlord. It became a financial entity. It kept detailed ledgers, recording the income from the toll gates on the left side of the page, and the expenditure for bandages, grain, and lamp oil on the right.
But the funding also came from the ground up. In the 13th and 14th centuries, it became incredibly common for ordinary citizens to include the local leper hospital in their last will and testament. A prosperous merchant might leave 3 silver shillings to the lazar house. A widow might leave her second-best wool cloak to the sisters of the hospital. These were not grand gestures of state. They were the quiet, steady drip of civic charity written into the municipal rolls year after year. And then there was the property of the lepers themselves. We must return to the great paradox of the separated life. The popular myth insists that the leper was stripped of everything, left entirely penniless by the mass of separation. But the surviving administrative rolls tell a very different, highly practical story. When a person of means was diagnosed with leprosy and admitted to a lazar house, it was often a financial transaction. It operated very much like a monastic corrody, a pension for life. The leper might surrender a portion of their estate, a flock of sheep, or the deed to a townhouse directly to the hospital. In exchange, the hospital guaranteed them a warm bed, a daily ration of pottage and bread, and a place in the chapel for the rest of their natural life.
They were purchasing their care. They were managing their assets from inside the exile. They were acting as legal citizens, negotiating the terms of their own survival. Even the poorest lepers, those who could not afford entry into a formal lazar house and were forced to live in small roadside hermitages, were woven into this economy. They were granted the legal right to beg. They stood at the crossroads or near the town gates. They were forbidden to approach, so they placed a wooden bowl or a hollowed-out stone on the ground, stepped back downwind, and sounded the clapper. Claw, claw, claw. The sound was softer here, further off, stripped of its initial terror. It became a rhythmic, expected part of the landscape. A merchant passing by would hear the knock of the wood, toss a small copper coin into the bowl, and ride on. The exchange was silent. The distance was maintained. The leper collected the coin, walked to the market, pointed their ash stick at a loaf of bread, and lived another day. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. The clerks in the bishop's palace administered the first half of that sentence, writing the diagnosis into the official record. The ledgers of the lazar house, the wills of the merchants, and the coppers in the wooden bowl administered the second half, keeping the physical body breathing while the soul did its holy work. When you strip away the black cloth of the funeral and the heavy theology of the humoral physicians, what you are left with is a system, a quiet, functioning, heavily documented system of ledgers, land grants, admission rules, and diagnostic panels. It was not a sudden spasm of fear. It was a settled, orderly arrangement that lasted for centuries. From today's view, the administration of leprosy looks like a terrifying bureaucracy of exile, a machine that processed human beings into ghosts with a few strokes of a quill. From their view, it was the necessary, practical work of maintaining order, ensuring that even the most agonizing of divine trials had a budget, a set of rules, and a place to sleep. And that's what's so chilling.
Tenby, Wales, on the rocky western coast of Britain. Built into the thick coastal limestone of the chancel wall at the parish church of St. Mary, there is a small, peculiar architectural feature. It is a narrow slit in the stonework, cut low to the ground. It is called a hagioscope, but local tradition and generations of parishioners have always called it something else entirely, a leper squint. Listen to what the stones are actually doing. The hole is cut narrow. It is chamfered on the sides to allow a wider field of vision. It is angled with exact geometric precision so that a person standing outside in the churchyard, kneeling in the damp, sea-salted grass, has a direct, unbroken line of sight to the high altar inside the nave. And the worst part isn't the cold wind blowing off the water, or the narrowness of the view, or the fact that the person outside was forbidden to enter. The worst part is the terrible, careful intimacy the window represents. Architectural historians will tell you that the true purpose of many of these slits is debated, that they may have been used by anchorites sealed in their cells, or bell ringers timing the sanctus bell. But the folk memory, the name that stuck to the stones for centuries, reveals exactly how the medieval mind understood the separated life. They built a window for them. It means the village did not want them entirely gone. It wanted them close and separate, both at once. It is the exact, impossible demand that the disease placed on the entire medieval world. We think of exile as a vanishing. We assume that when the mass of separation ended, the leper walked into the deep forest, swallowed by the wilderness, and was simply erased from the memory of the town. We picture them as faceless ghosts haunting the barren places of the earth. But medieval Europe was not an empty wilderness. It was a dense, cultivated network of parishes, fields, and market roads. Separation did not mean disappearance. The leper lived at the edge of the exact same community that had buried them. The vast majority of lepers did not vanish into the woods. If they were fortunate enough to secure a bed in a foundation, they lived in a lazar house, like the great hospital of St. Giles, built right on the arterial highway just outside the city walls. If they were not, they lived in small, rudimentary timber huts constructed on the heath just beyond the boundary stones of their own parish. They became a permanent, expected fixture of the roadside. The physical geography of this coexistence was the road, the rutted dirt tracks, the stone bridges, the busy town gates. Because endowments sometimes ran dry, and because many lepers lived outside the formal hospital system, the vast majority survived through a system of licensed begging. The local magistrates or the town council would issue a formal document, a begging license. It was written on parchment. It was stamped with a heavy wax seal. It granted a specific named leper the legal right to stand at a specific crossroads or at the edge of a specific market. Imagine the daily reality of that arrangement. The leper did not wander aimlessly, terrifying the countryside. They had an appointed station. They walked out to the turnpike in the early morning. They placed their wooden bowl on a flat stone. They stepped back, downwind into the scrub brush, and they waited.
They stood there in the searing heat of August, wearing the heavy russet cloak. They stood there in the freezing sleet of November, their leather boots sinking into the mud. They watched the life of the village go on without them. They watched the farmers driving the ox carts to the mill. They watched the merchants carrying wool to the fairs. They watched the seasons turn, the wheat grow high and the wheat cut down, entirely from the outside. And they announced their presence. Claw, claw, claw. The sound of the wooden rattle drifted across the fields. The villagers working in the harvest heard it. The carters pulling on the reins heard it. The sound was not a mystery. The villagers knew exactly who was making the noise. It was not a nameless monster. It was the baker's apprentice, the young man whose bones we found in Winchester. It was the sister who used to weave linen in the high street. The day the priest handed them the wood, the transaction was absolute. You belong to the bell now. But the bell also belonged to the village. The sound became a metronome for the community, a quiet, rhythmic reminder echoing over the hedgerows that their exiled children were still breathing, still hungry, still waiting by the road. The texture of this coexistence was infinitely more complicated than simple cruelty. The historical record holds a full human spectrum of fear and mercy running side by side, day after day. There was genuine, profound fear. The humoral theory of corrupted air, the theological terror of hidden sin, these were real forces in the medieval mind. There were neighbors who bolted their doors when they heard the clapper. There were children who ran into the alleyways. There were travelers who crossed themselves, tightened their grip on their reins, and spurred their horses into a fast trot to get past the crossroads before the wind could blow the leper's corrupted breath toward them. But alongside the fear, there was the family. This is the deepest, quietest sadness of the separated life. The mass of separation dissolved life, but it did not dissolve human memory. The mother of the young man in Winchester did not suddenly forget she had a son. The husband of a woman sent to the lazar house did not forget his wife. The records show us, in quiet, sideways glimpses, how families continued to care for the people they were legally required to shun. Think of the mechanics of that care. A mother in the village wraps a loaf of dark rye bread and a piece of hard yellow cheese in a linen cloth. She walks out of the village at dusk, when the light is failing and the roads are quiet. She walks to the boundary stone or the edge of the woods near the roadside hut. She leaves the food on the rock. She steps back 20 paces. She waits to see the figure in the heavy cloak emerge from the trees. She watches her child pick up the bread. She watches her child raise a thickly gloved hand in a silent gesture of thanks. She cannot speak, because speaking would require the leper to turn their face away and answer downwind. She cannot cross the grass. She cannot touch the leather glove.
The heartbreak of the medieval road is the mother who can see her child, who can feed her child, but who is legally and spiritually forbidden to close the last 20 feet of distance. This is why the leper window, the squint cut into the cold stone of the chancel wall, is the perfect image of the age. It was the architectural embodiment of the paradox. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. The village believed the leper was suffering their purgatory on earth. They believed the leper's prayers were uniquely powerful, a direct line to the throne of heaven. And so, on a Sunday morning, the village gathered inside the warm, candlelit church. The priest elevated the host. The incense rose to the timber roof. And outside, kneeling in the damp grass, shivering in the heavy cloak, the leper looked through the narrow slit in the stone. They were entirely outside the community of the living, and yet they were participating in the exact same Mass, the healthy and the afflicted, separated by 2 feet of solid limestone, praying toward the exact same altar. Think about what it did to a community to live like this for generations, to keep their buried alive at arm's length. It was a long, slow, quiet strangeness. It required a staggering amount of psychological endurance from everyone involved. The baker baking an extra loaf for the bowl at the crossroads, the town council debating the renewal of the begging licenses, the nursing brothers at the lazar house mending the heavy wool cloaks, the travelers checking the direction of the wind before asking a figure in the distance for directions. When you look closely at the road, you do not find a simple story of villains casting out the innocent. You do not find a fairy tale of pure saints nursing the sick. You find something much harder and much more human. You find ordinary people on both sides of the clapper's warning, simply living with an impossible situation. You find a village and its lepers going on, living side by side, divided by a wooden rattle and a gust of wind. From today's view, this looks like a society torturing its sick with an impossible, agonizing proximity. From their view, it was the only way to honor both the safety of the living and the dignity of the dead. And that's what's so chilling. London, the early years of the 12th century. The air in the royal apartments is thick with the scent of burning beeswax and imported spices, a heavy, expensive warmth designed to keep the damp of the English autumn at bay. A basin of water rests on the floor. It is not made of gold or silver, but plain, practical metal. Beside it rests a simple linen towel, and kneeling on the floor, her hands submerged in the warm water, is the Queen of England. We have walked a long way down a very dark road. For 8 chapters, we have stood in the shadow of the disease. We have listened to the chilling Latin of the Mass of Separation. We have watched the heavy black cloth fall over the shoulders of the living. We have catalogued the leather gloves, the pointing sticks, the begging bowls, and the terrible bureaucratic machinery of exile. We have heard the flat, dry knock of the wooden clapper until it feels like the only sound the medieval world knew how to make. Cla, cla, cla. But the road does not end in total darkness. It is the signature promise of this channel that we do not leave you in the cold. Before we close the book on the separated life, we have to look at the light. Because the history of leprosy is not simply a ledger of cruelty. It is a profound paradox. The exact same system that built the boundaries also, quietly, allowed for moments where those boundaries were crossed. Inside the rules, inside the fear, and inside the heavy theology of the humoral mind, there were pockets of extraordinary, documented grace. Tonight, as the hour grows late and the road grows quiet, we are going to look at 3 small mercies, 3 real historical moments where human tenderness broke through a system built entirely on distance. 3 moments where the care was allowed, at last, to have the final word. The first mercy is the mercy of the powerful choosing freely to draw near. Let us return to Queen Matilda, the wife of King Henry I. In the year 1101, she endowed the great hospital of St. Giles in the Fields. But money is easy to give when you wear a crown. It requires no physical risk to sign a charter, or to grant a parcel of land, or to order your clerks to deliver a sack of silver pennies to the edge of town. What the chroniclers record about Matilda goes far beyond a royal signature. The abbot Aelred of Rivos wrote down the account of the queen's brother David stepping into her private chambers. He expected to find the queen engaged in the normal, insulated business of a medieval court. Instead, he found the room filled with lepers, men and women whose faces were marked by the absolute worst the disease could do. People who had been legally exiled from the markets and the mills of the kingdom. Matilda was kneeling on the floor. She was taking their feet that were numb, thickened, and weeping, and she was washing them in the warm water of the basin. She was drying them with the linen towel.
The chroniclers tell us that her own household recoiled. Her brother was terrified, warning her that the king would never kiss her again if he knew what she had touched. But Matilda did not stop. She understood the theology of her age perfectly. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. She believed she was washing the feet of the living saints. Think of the physical sensation for the leper sitting in that chair. Since the day the priest read their funeral, they had been told they were a source of absolute, corrupting miasma. They had been told to stand downwind. They had been told never to touch a healthy hand. And now the Queen of England was kneeling on the floor, holding their feet in warm water, refusing to pull away. It was a mercy that completely upended the social order of the world. It was a reminder that even the highest crown in the kingdom could bow to the heavy, holy burden of the afflicted. The second mercy is quieter and in many ways much harder. It is the mercy written in the bones. There are no chroniclers for the ordinary leper. There are no abbots writing down the deeds of the baker or the weaver or the farmer. The vast majority of the people who carried the clapper left no written record of their names, but they left something far more enduring. They left the archaeology of their own care. Let us return to the high, chalky ridge of Magdalen Hill in Winchester.
When the archaeologists excavated the cemetery of the Hospital of St. Mary Magdalene, they found the remains of people like the young man we called Skeleton 8, people who had lived with the disease for a decade or 2 decades or more. When you look at the extreme state of those bones, you are looking at a physical impossibility unless you factor in the presence of continuous daily love. Leprosy slowly takes away the ability of the body to maintain itself. Without sensation in the hands, you cannot safely tend a fire. Without fingers, you cannot hold a spoon. Without feet, you cannot walk to the well. If the medieval world had truly treated these people as nothing more than infected waste, they would have died of starvation or exposure within a single winter. But the bones prove they lived for years. This means that somewhere in the cold, damp dark of a 13th century winter, a mercy was occurring every single day. A nursing brother or a sister of the house, or a fellow leper whose hands were not yet taken, woke up in the dark. They struck a flint. They lit a candle. They built up the fire in the hearth to keep the chill out of the dormitory. They walked over to the bed of a man who could no longer move. They lifted a wooden bowl filled with warm salted broth. They held it patiently to his lips. When the broth spilled, they wiped his chin. When his linen sheets were soiled, they stripped the bed, washed his frail body with warm water and a rough cloth, and laid him back down on clean, dry straw. They did this day after day, month after month, year after year, for no grand reward. They did it in the quiet obscurity of the hospital ward, long after the rest of the world had forgotten the patient existed.
And when the end finally came, the mercy continued into the earth. The graves at Winchester were not chaotic, panicked pits. They were dug neatly into the chalk. The bodies were washed. They were wrapped carefully in linen shrouds, the fabric pulled tight and fastened with small, delicate brass shrouding pins. They were laid on their backs, with their arms crossed over their chests. Most importantly, they were laid facing east, exactly as they would have been if they had died a healthy merchant or a high-born lord. They were positioned to face the rising sun, waiting for the resurrection. It is a mercy that leaves no name, but it is absolute proof that someone, entirely unrecorded by history, chose to care. The third and final mercy is the mercy of the window and the wall. It is the daily, ungrand kindness of the ordinary neighbor. We have seen the leper squint, the narrow hagioscope cut into the thick limestone wall of churches like the one at Tenby. We know that the architectural purpose of these slits is debated by historians, but we also know why the folk memory attached the name of the leper to them. Because the medieval village was deeply, inextricably bound to its exiles. Think of the family that came to the gate. The mass of separation demanded a complete severing. It demanded that the husband forget the wife, that the mother forget the son. It told the leper, "You belong to the bell now." But the human heart has never been very good at obeying the decrees of a council. The records show us again and again the small subversions of ordinary love. The mother who baked a loaf of soft white bread, the expensive kind, the kind meant for feast days. She wrapped it in a clean cloth. She walked out to the boundary stone at the edge of the parish, out where the road turned toward the heath. She left the bread on the cold stone. She stepped back. She waited in the twilight until she heard the slow, familiar sound from the trees.
Cla, cla, cla. She watched the figure in the heavy russet cloak emerge from the shadows. She watched her child pick up the bread. She did not speak. She did not break the law of the wind. But she stood there, and she let her child know that the funeral read over them in the church was not the end of their family. She refused to let the bell be the whole of a person. This is the mercy of the village that would not completely let go. The merchant who always made sure to drop a heavy silver coin rather than a copper one into the wooden bowl at the crossroads. The priest who stood close to the narrow slit in the stone wall, speaking the words of the Mass just a little bit louder, so the person kneeling in the damp grass outside could hear the comfort of the Latin. These are not grand, sweeping cures. They did not stop the disease. They did not dismantle the brutal, bureaucratic machinery of the separated life. The clapper still had to be sounded, the wind still had to be checked, the heavy boots still had to be worn. But in a world that firmly believed it was dealing with a terrifying, contagious manifestation of divine will, these small mercies are staggering. They are the proof that compassion can survive inside the most rigid structures of fear. The queen's hands in the basin of water, the nursing brother lifting the bowl of broth, the mother leaving bread on the stone. From today's view, these mercies look like tiny, desperate acts of mitigation in a system of overwhelming institutionalized cruelty. From their view, they were the profound daily work of loving the living saints, an unbroken chain of human tenderness stretching across the boundary line of the grave. And that's what's so beautiful.
Canterbury, England, in the middle of the 15th century. A clerk working at the Hospital of St. Nicholas at Harbledown takes up a pen to balance the ledgers of the foundation. Listen to what his quiet accounts reveal. The endowments from the wealthy merchants are still paying out. The tenant farmers on the hospital's estates are still sending their annual rents of grain and silver. The heavy bronze chapel bell is still ringing the canonical hours across the sloping wooded hills of Kent. But the beds in the main hall are empty. And the worst part isn't the empty beds, or the silent courtyard, or the sudden strange surplus of charity with no one left to receive it. The worst part is that the clerk, smoothing his parchment by candlelight, has absolutely no idea where the afflicted have gone. There was no treaty signed with the disease. There was no sudden miraculous cure discovered by a university physician in a candlelit room. There was no triumphant day when the last leper walked out of the lazar house, threw their wooden clapper into the fire, and embraced their family in the crowded town square. The end of the separated life did not happen all at once. It happened the way a tide goes out in the dark, slowly, imperceptibly, and without a single sound. From the 14th century onward, the disease that had defined 1,000 years of fear and charity simply loosened its grip on the European continent. It grew rarer, the houses grew quieter, and one by one the bells stopped. Until the loudest thing left of it all was the silence where the clapper used to be. If we look closely at the historical record, the retreat of leprosy from medieval Europe remains one of the great quiet mysteries of medical history. The historians and the epidemiologists still debate exactly why it happened, and they offer theories that are as complex and deeply interwoven as the medieval world itself. Some point to the catastrophic arrival of the Black Death in 1348. The plague was a fast, indiscriminate killer, but it was especially lethal to the weakened, the marginalized, and the communal. A lazar house filled with individuals already suffering from compromised immune systems and living in incredibly close quarters was a perfect, tragic target for the plague bacterium. It did not care about the humoral balance or the theology of purgatory. Whole hospitals were emptied in a matter of weeks, erasing entire populations of the separated in a single devastating summer. The plague essentially scoured the leper from the landscape. Others point to a microscopic war fought entirely within the human bloodstream. The rise of tuberculosis in the later Middle Ages provides a compelling, completely silent explanation. Tuberculosis and leprosy are caused by closely related bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Mycobacterium leprae. Historians hypothesize that as the sprawling, increasingly crowded cities of the late medieval period fostered the explosive spread of tuberculosis, the deadlier pulmonary disease essentially outcompeted leprosy. It either killed those who were most genetically susceptible to the leprosy bacterium before the slow-moving leprosy could fully take hold, or, in a strange biological paradox, exposure to the tuberculosis bacterium conferred a natural, invisible cross-immunity to leprosy. The crowded cities cured the disease by replacing it with another. Still others argue it was a matter of shifting diagnoses and gradually changing living conditions. As the late medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, university-trained physicians began to rely less on the old, rigid humoral texts and more on direct empirical observation. The vast, terrifying umbrella of the Judicium Leprosorum began to close. The examining juries stopped categorizing severe eczema, psoriasis, and fungal infections as lepra, and as the standard of living incrementally improved across the continent, as homes grew slightly warmer, as diets incorporated more fresh food, as the heavy wool garments were washed more frequently, the slow-growing, weakly contagious microbe simply lost its foothold in the population. Whatever the true mechanism, plague, cross-immunity, or a shifting medical lens, the result was undeniable. The disease was retreating. But institutions, once they are built, do not simply vanish into the air. What do you do with over 300 lazar houses across England alone when the lepers stop coming to the gates? You repurpose them. The vast, entrenched apparatus of separation slowly wound down, and the architecture of exile was transformed into an architecture of general mercy. The Hospital of St. Nicholas at Harbledown did not close its heavy oak doors. It simply changed the parameters of its admissions. The beds that had once held the lepers of Kent were quietly offered to the elderly, the blind, and the destitute. It became a general almshouse, the endowments pivoting to feed the ordinary poor. Other foundations met a much more sudden end. The great complex at Burton Lazars, once the proud headquarters of the leper knights of the Order of St. Lazarus, was caught in the sweeping political changes of the English Reformation. When King Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries and the religious hospitals in the 16th century, the royal commissioners arrived at the gates. The ledgers were seized. The silver chalices were melted down. The sprawling complex at Burton Lazars was dissolved, its lands sold off to wealthy courtiers, the hospital eventually falling into ruin until nothing was left but grass and a name on a map. And the villages let the memory fade. The busy market roads forgot the flat, dry sound of the wooden rattle, but the stones remembered. If you walk the English landscape today, away from the highways and the modern glass, you can still find the physical anchors of the separated life. You can walk up the sloping, quiet hill at Harbledown and stand inside the original Norman chapel of St. Nicholas. The stones of the walls are the exact same stones the lepers touched as they listened to the priest. The cold air in the nave is the same air that carried the hoarse, rasping chanting of the afflicted. The institution outlived its original purpose, but the chapel outlived the institution. You can travel to the rugged western coast of Wales and stand outside the parish church in Tenby. You can feel the cold, salt wind blowing off the Irish Sea and run your hand along the chamfered edge of the leper squint. The narrow window is still there, cut low to the ground, staring blindly at the high altar. It holds the memory of the villagers who knelt in the damp grass, shivering in their heavy cloaks, and watched the Mass from the outside. The stone still holds the exact shape of their exile, and you can walk the high, wind-swept chalk ridge of Magdalen Hill in Winchester. The hospital buildings are long gone. The timber dormitories have rotted away to nothing. The hearth fires have been cold for centuries. But beneath the grass, the careful east-facing graves remain. The bones of the young man with no hands, the baker's apprentice who was fed and washed for years by the brothers of the house, still rest in the earth. He is lying exactly where the nursing brothers laid him. The archaeology holds the absolute, undeniable truth of the medieval paradox. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. The stones of the chapel, and the narrow slit in the chancel wall, and the bones resting in the chalk are the final, enduring proof that the medieval world meant exactly what it said. They buried the leper, but they did not abandon them. They built a staggering system of total exile, and then they built a community inside it. The day the priest handed the wood to the afflicted at the edge of the churchyard, the transaction was absolute. You belong to the bell now. But time has finally broken the transaction. The bell has fallen completely silent. The leper no longer belongs to the clapper, or to the heavy russet habit, or to the white ash pointing stick. They belong to memory. Kept safe in the cold stone of the lazar house and the quiet bone of the cemetery and the fading ledgers of the medieval clerks. There is one last place where the memory is kept. Cla, cla, cla. The sound is faint now, a ghost of a rhythm fading gently into the dark. If you go into the climate-controlled archive of a medical history museum today, long after the visitors have gone home, and you ask the curator to open the drawer, you can still see the clapper. It sits on a piece of gray archival foam, resting safely behind the glass. It is entirely silent. The thick leather hinge is stiff and brittle, cracking with age. The ash wood is dark with the centuries. But the handle is still perfectly smooth. It was smoothed by a real human hand, a hand that slowly lost its feeling, a hand that belonged to someone who walked the dirt roads of Europe, asking only for a wide berth and a small copper coin. It is the sound of a door closing softly on a story that is at last over. Because we know the end of the medical mystery.
In 1873, in a quiet laboratory in Norway, the physician Gerhard Armauer Hansen looked through the lens of a microscope and identified Mycobacterium leprae. He finally saw the slow, rod-shaped bacterium that had terrified kings, bishops, and peasants alike. He proved it was not the physical manifestation of hidden sin. He proved it was not a catastrophic excess of black bile. He proved it was not the breath of the devil riding on the wind. Today, leprosy is known to modern medicine as Hansen's disease. It is entirely curable. A simple, highly effective regimen of multi-drug therapy, provided completely free of charge by the World Health Organization, kills the pathogen and halts the disease in its tracks. A patient placed on this medication is rendered non-contagious within a matter of days. The terrible, creeping unmaking of the human body can be stopped entirely with a pill. The disease has, tragically, never entirely left the world.
It still lingers in pockets of the globe where extreme poverty, stigma, and a lack of access to basic medicine allow it to take root and hold on. But the terror, the absolute soul-crushing certainty of a lifelong, inescapable exile is gone. The medieval fear was of something we can now easily cure. The mass of separation will never be read over a living person again. As we leave the dark, rutted roads of the Middle Ages behind, as we walk away from the boundary stones and the wooden begging bowls, we can look back at the lazar house at the edge of town and finally understand what we are looking at. It is not a horror story. It is a story of incredible endurance. It is the story of ordinary people trapped inside a terrifying medical reality and a heavy theological framework, doing the absolute best they could to keep the living and the dead sharing the same earth. From today's view, the separated life looks like a tragedy of profound ignorance, 1,000 years of unnecessary exile, waiting desperately for the invention of antibiotics. From their view, it was a long, slow, careful walk to heaven, taken one step at a time to the sound of a wooden bell. And that's what's so chilling.
London, the summer of 2026. If you walk through the vast, climate-controlled galleries of the city's great medical archives, places like the Science Museum or the Wellcome Collection, past the polished brass of 19th-century surgical kits and the heavy glass of old apothecary jars, you will eventually come to a very quiet display. Resting under a thick pane of exhibition glass, mounted carefully on a piece of gray archival foam, is a wooden object. It is deeply unassuming. It is not made of gold or silver or carved ivory. It is made of two flat boards of ordinary ash wood bound together by a thick strip of leather with a simple rounded handle at the base. It is a medieval leper's clapper, a clacla. Look closely at it through the glass. The light in the museum is kept dim to protect the artifacts from fading, but even in the low illumination, you can see the texture of the wood. The boards are dark with age, nicked and scarred by decades of daily use. But the handle is different. The handle is polished to a beautiful, almost liquid smoothness. It was not sanded by a carpenter. It was smoothed by the constant, desperate friction of a human hand, a thumb and a palm gripping the wood tightly, day after day, year after year, on the long dirt roads of medieval Europe. And the most striking thing about the object isn't its age or its crude construction or the worn grain of the handle. The most striking thing is the profound, heartbreaking irony of where it sits today. 700 years ago, this piece of wood was the ultimate instrument of separation. It was the physical manifestation of exile. Its entire purpose was to drive humanity away. When the person holding it raised their hand and sounded the wooden rattle, the farmers in the fields turned their backs. The merchants on the road pulled their horses to the side. The mothers in the village gathered their children and hurried behind closed doors. The sound it made was a wedge that cracked the world in half, creating a 20-foot bubble of empty, untouchable space wherever the leper walked. Cla, cla, cla. But today, in 2026, the exact same object does the exact opposite. It does not push people away, it draws them in. Visitors walk through the museum, they see the strange wooden rattle sitting in its case, and they step closer. They lean down, they press their hands against the glass, they read the small white placard, they try to imagine the weight of it in their own hands. An object that was built to ensure a human being was never looked at, is now safely, quietly, and permanently held in the light for everyone to see.
The people who carried these clappers left almost no names in the historical record. We do not know who held the specific piece of ash wood resting in the London archive. We do not know if they were a baker from Winchester, or a weaver from York, or a farmer from the rolling hills of Kent. We do not know what their voice sounded like before the disease thickened their vocal cords. We do not know if they wept when the earth was cast onto their boots in the churchyard. But the object remembers the fact of them. It remembers the weight of their hand. And the wider landscape of Europe remembers them too. The heavy stone walls of the chapel at Harbledown still stand, remembering the hoarse, quiet chanting of the afflicted who prayed for the souls of the healthy. The chalky earth of Magdalen Hill in Winchester still holds the neat, east-facing graves, remembering the profound daily mercy of the nursing brothers who washed the dying and laid them to rest with dignity. We began this night in the shadows. We began with the terrifying Latin of the Mass of Separation, with the heavy black cloth, with the absolute stripping away of a life. But as we have walked down the road, past the boundary stones and the begging bowls, we have found a truth that is infinitely gentler than the myth. You are dead to the world and alive to God, both at once. The medieval world believed the first half of that sentence required a funeral, but they believed the second half required a home. They built the lazar houses, they baked the extra bread. They cut the narrow squints into the walls of the churches so that the exiled were never entirely cut off from the light of the altar. They were a society terrified of a disease they could not understand, but at their very best they refused to let their fear entirely erase their humanity. The day the priest handed the clapper to the leper at the edge of the cemetery, the sentence was absolute. You belong to the bell now. But the bell has stopped. The long, impossible trial of the separated life is over. The disease that built the walls has been mapped and sequenced and cured. The lazar houses have faded into the green grass of the English countryside. The fear is gone, and in the absolute quiet that is left behind, the leper no longer belongs to the warning rattle. They belong to us. They belong to memory, kept safe in the glass cases and the quiet chapels, remembered at last not as monsters and not as outcasts, but as the ordinary, enduring people they never stopped being. From today's view, the clapper is just a piece of silent wood behind a pane of museum glass. From their view, it was the entire heavy weight of a human life carried patiently down a long, dusty road. And that's what's so beautiful. The night is over. The road is clear. The gates are open, and there is no one left waiting in the dark. It is time to let the history rest. Sleep well.